Well, good morning, all. Welcome to the 13th Annual Conference of the Center on Capitalism and Society. As you know, the Center arose out of the crying need to understand better what some of us at the Center have come to call modern capitalist economies. They lap up plausible new ideas which lead to speculation, fluctuation, and most important, innovation. The Center has come a long way on that road, though we won't celebrate our 13th anniversary. But it's pertinent, I think, to note two other anniversaries this year. 2015 is the 200th anniversary of the modern economy, if the historian Paul Johnson has got it right. And 2015 is also the 400th anniversary of the publication of the vitalist novel Don Quixote, which is certainly one of the foundations of the cultural background to the modern capitalist economies. The last two conferences focused on the significant losses of indigenous innovation and thus human flourishing in much of the West. This annual conference focuses on what our country and other countries can do to increase indigenous innovation, steps to mass flourishing. Of course, some of the steps we might take would aim to repel the values, institutions, and practices inimical to dynamism. It's not as if we're going to invent new pathways, though maybe we can. To paraphrase Lord Kelvin, if you want to improve it, you have to measure it. And so the opening session will report on measures of innovation, empirical measures of innovation, derived by my collaborators in the research project on innovating and flourishing that we have embarked on. The conference will also report on, this session will also report on the drivers of innovation. In my theoretical system, what we may call the indigenous innovation of a nation depends on the nation's dynamism, the desire, the capacity, and the latitude to innovate. And as I think we would all agree, this dynamism is in turn sparked by some key values in the nation's culture: individualism, vitalism, and expressionism. Later in the morning, we will hear two presentations touching on innovation and flourishing, one referring to Greece and to the Mezzogiorno, the other to the OECD countries. These will be followed by a roundtable on innovation in the West. We can expect that the luncheon speech by Peter Thiel will also shed light on innovation. There's considerable skepticism that dynamism and the innovation it succeeds in achieving ever produced much flourishing at all. The afternoon begins with a session in which three economic historians will present some findings of theirs on this subject. Through time, values may be changing, however. Increasingly, we hear the suggestion that young people would derive more satisfaction from participating in organizations emerged in making investments offering the hope of a desired social impact rather than a desirable private impact. The next session takes up some questions on this that this impact investing raises. What are the benefits and what are the costs of that for innovation and for flourishing? The last session of the conference takes up the hypothesis that an evolution in social values has occurred, and it is suppressing individual initiative, thus narrowing the volume of innovation and thus reducing human flourishing. To heighten dynamism, we want to find out which values positive for individual initiative and innovation have declined, and which values inimical to initiative and innovation have grown stronger. Thank you very much. I'm going to start off by introducing this session, I put together a research team of Gylfi Zoega, Raicho Bojilov, and Saifedean Ammous, roughly in order of seniority, I think, to try to test the main ideas in my book, Mass Flourishing, and to see whether changes or additions might appear to be desirable. Let me take a minute to sketch the argument of the book. And I'm sorry that I dropped some of this inadvertently in my previous introduction. The hypothesis, the central hypothesis, is that people in the business sector, not just scientists, explorers, and artists, who are typically exogenous to the business sector, are capable of creativity. They can use their imagination, as David Hume would have said, to conceive a new product or method, and use their ingenuity, as Frank Tausig used to talk about forever, to build a new thing. How much innovation a nation's people are capable of, the nation's dynamism, depends on people's traits or their spirit, as Max Weber would have said if he were here today. The prevalence among individuals of the desire to innovate, that's surely essential. The capacity of individuals to innovate, their insightfulness, their savvy, and the latitude that society, community, and family grants to innovators, all that is very central to the spirit of that is necessary for innovation, as I argue in my book, correctly or incorrectly. How much innovation, how much dynamism a nation has, I then argue, depends on its ethic or culture or values. Individualism, thinking for oneself, for example, is a key value. Also vitalism, the desire for excitement and challenge. And expressionism, voyaging into the unknown, making a mark, giving something to society. Those are, in my view, very important aspects of the culture on which the spirit of innovation depends. The right values, finally, if the values are right in a nation, these right values will lead to greater job satisfaction and life satisfaction. So there's a payoff besides high productivity. There's a payoff in terms of flourishing. Now, let me just, I had a compulsion to jot down something by way of a preface to the report that Raicho Bojilov will be making. How do we measure indigenous innovation, the kind that bubbles up from the business sector? Well, first of all, how do we measure the efficiency or the effectiveness of average practice, the practices, the economic practices of a country on average? Well, the growth rate of average practice is the growth rate of the effectiveness of average practice is roughly captured by the growth rate of total factor productivity. So we have data on total factor productivity. So we regard that as the growth rate of, as the rate of improvement of practice, of average practice. And that's A dot over A on the screen. And then we start with a hypothesis about how that's determined. The Nelson Phelps had a theory about that, which is that average practice is increasing if best practice is, if there's a gap, if best practice is greater than average practice, then that pulls up average practice. Meanwhile, Chicago was mesmerized by the idea of human capital. And they said that the rate of improvement of total factor productivity is a function of the growth rate of human capital, such as Ted Schultz in 1961. I'm going to drop that from the equations now. We have complexities enough. Now, what do we have to say? What are our hypotheses about the growth rate of best practice? B dot, or the time rate. That B dot is, strictly speaking, the time rate of change of B. The growth rate is B dot over B. Well, there's Schumpeter with this notion of, with the German historical school notion of exogenous explorers and scientists who once in a while make a discovery, and that's an exogenous shock striking all countries in the world, and these countries more or less respond quickly thanks to entrepreneurs. These countries respond more or less quickly to take advantage of the commercial application that is suggested by the scientific discovery. And for the longest time, this was 100% of the economics of innovation. This crude idea of the German historical school that its roots are all outside the economy. Then, in the early 60s, in my fanciful history of this subject, it's not exactly accurate, there are the neo-Schumpeterians, like Dick Nelson sitting over there. And the latest of them is Philippe Aghion, whom we have recorded. He'll come on later. The argument there was, as Schumpeter himself noticed towards the end of his career, he said, gee, some of these corporations are big enough to have industrial labs, and they can make like scientists and make discoveries which may have, with luck, some commercial applications for the company. So the research effort, RIT, has some effectiveness measured by the coefficient rho as a contribution to B dot, the rate at which best practice is improving. Last but not least, in the early thinking, there was Hayek. What did Hayek say, class? Hayek said that business people, not just zestful entrepreneurs, business people of high acumen and powers of observation and long experience in their industry, business people are kind of good at discerning the occasional opportunity to make a buck, which leads to improvements in the efficiency of the economy. And Hayek speaks of of the discovery of these opportunities. He calls them adaptations. He didn't call them innovations for the sake of clarity, and I'm grateful to him for that. So you have these adaptations, and that's another source of the growth rate of best practice. And then, in some countries, of course, they're behind the others, and so they enjoy cross-border technological transfer from outside their country into inside their country, and that's another influence on the growth rate of best practice. And then finally, we come to the idea, and I can't possibly be the originator of that, but for the time being, I haven't thought of who is. what I call indigenous innovation, the innovation that springs up from the business sector, ETA. And that's the equation. And so we have a two-equation system here with one of the variables inconveniently not measured. It's sort of what Eric calls a latent variable. But with a little bit of fooling around with the algebra, I think you can get somewhere. And I indicate at the bottom of the equation the direction in which I thought I was going when I had to stop a few months ago, and I never did get back to it. But Raicho has his own way of proceeding.
Good morning, everyone. I have the great pleasure of presenting the first part of our work, which is related to the statistical analysis of the series of total factor productivity across developed economies and over time, comprising the period from 1950 until 2011. Now, total factor productivity measures are, for all intents and purposes, measures of our ignorance. Economists obtain those numbers by netting out of GDP growth the impact of anything that they can think of, namely increasing or change in capital formation, population, human capital characteristics, accumulation, and so forth. And what is left out is labeled basically total factor productivity. It is a residual. Okay? Now, I'm not sure that that has increased your confidence in the economics profession, but that is what we do. Okay? And this is the object that we use in our empirical analysis. We take the total factor productivity series for a set of 21 developed economies, and then we study the statistical properties of those series. And we try to basically make an inference about the nature and the source of productivity gains by looking at the statistical properties of those total factor, series of total factor productivity. Okay? So what we basically are going to do is we're going to consider a generalized version of the what you may call Aghion, Nelson, Phelps model of TFP decomposition, in which we allow for correlation in the innovation shocks over time for the same country and across countries. Okay? What we are going to do is, in a sense, is going to lead to several results that I just briefly would like to summarize. First, we look at countries that generate indigenous innovation. And this is indigenous innovation which spills out across their borders and affects TFP growth of other economies. Okay? We find that the main sources of indigenous innovation in the world are the United States, the UK, and a couple of Scandinavian countries. That is a finding which holds for the whole period of our study. Then we actually also investigate whether there are any structural breaks in the series. And in particular, what we find is that the period between 1950 and 72 is characterized by a much higher level of indigenous innovation than the following period across countries. And we find that indeed the decline in indigenous innovation in the US and in the UK is relatively much greater than in other European countries, particularly continental European countries, which is actually quite striking. Okay? So how does this set of preliminary results that follow up on the model outlined by Ned fit into the bigger picture of our research agenda. Basically, what we do here is we try to isolate a part of the productivity growth in a country that we can attribute to indigenous factors. And then, as a second step, we are going to try to relate this mysterious indigenous innovation residual to measures of economic culture, attitudes, beliefs, and we hope that we'll be able to establish eventually a causal relation. And then finally, we would like to relate also those empirical results to the results that we can obtain by using other methods of analysis. Namely, if we would like to relate those results to findings based on case studies, particularly for developing and industrializing countries in which data is of low quality or in which basically the economic system changed dramatically several times in the last decades. Okay? So let me just briefly describe to you what's the intuition of the model. So the intuition is really captured in the original paper by Nelson and Phelps, in which they consider innovation in basically a rural society. There is a farmer who comes up with an interesting idea, new ways of planting seeds or new kinds of seeds, and he or she is successful. So then what happens is that the neighbors look at what's happening across the fence, and they actually pick up on the idea and they implement it. And in this way, basically, the innovation spreads across the community. This basic idea is the foundation of a popular existing way of summarizing TFP growth and thinking about TFP growth, which is presented at the bottom of this slide, in which basically TFP is the sum of two things. One is innovation which is adopted from abroad, which is the product of adoption rate times basically the distance to frontier, i.e. the distance between the technological leader and the TFP in a given country. And then there is another term which accounts for potentially indigenous innovation, or things which are orthogonal to developments in other countries. Okay? Relative to this basic framework, what we do is we allow for two things. First, we allow each country to have its own indigenous innovation, which potentially may affect productivity growth in other countries. So there is no longer one technological leader. There may be a couple of countries and that generate innovation which afterwards propagates across the world. And then the other possibility that we allow is that, in fact, it may not be that the country picks up the idea from the technological leader, but potentially from its neighbors, countries with similar culture, the same language, and so on. Okay? Now, a bit more formally, this is the formal presentation. I think Ned more or less presented the basic ideas already, so let me just very briefly go through it. So we assume we decompose basically TFP, the TFP productivity measures into best practice, okay, plus an innovation shock. And the best practice itself is the sum of two things. One is a transmissible best practice, that is something which other countries potentially can copy, and then there is non-transmissible best practices which are specific to that particular country. Okay? Now, each of those best practice, both the transmissible and the non-transmissible best practice, are essentially a weighted sum of past innovation shocks. Okay? And here what we allow is we allow essentially for correlation between the best practice shocks for the transmissible shocks across countries, and we also allow for basically autocorrelation in the non-transmissible shocks for a given country. And then TFP growth in a country is presented at the bottom. It's basically the sum of two things. One is the innovation or the best practice shocks that are imported from abroad, And then the other one is basically the sum of the transmissible and non-transmissible domestic shocks. Okay? So here is just a two-country example to fix ideas. This is just to illustrate that our framework incorporates some special cases that already exist and that are quite popular. The first one is autarky. Okay? So autarky is presented where the pointer is at the moment. And it's just saying that well, innovation in a country is something which is some kind of a random process which has nothing to do with what's happening in other countries. The second example is about a case in which we have a technological leader. This is country one, and then all other countries are copying from this country. Okay? Now, estimating this model is a bit complicated because not only we have to uncover the stochastic dependence over time for a given country in its TFP series, but we also have to essentially uncover the network through which shocks propagate across countries. Okay? So, in other words, we're trying to combine into the same framework the ideas of autocorrelated or dependent time series and spatial correlation. Okay? Now, I wouldn't go through the details, but we basically have two steps of doing that. In the first step, we try to uncover the network through which shocks are transmitted, and in the second one, we estimate the rest of the parameters. So here are a couple of details. As I already mentioned, we have the data that we use is coming from the Penn-Worrell tables. We have 21 countries, and we cover the period 1950 to 2011. Okay? So without further ado, let me just reiterate what are the three main objects of interest to us. The first one is indigenous innovation in a given country, which is the sum of the transmissible and non-transmissible best practices, okay, in that country. And then the other object of interest is the imported innovation, which is basically the transmissible shocks which a country which affect one's country's productivity growth. Okay? And finally, our estimated or fitted measure of productivity is the sum of the two. Okay? So here, very briefly, the numbers that we get for the first period of our study, 1950-72. We find out that basically there has been the average annual TFP growth in the sample is something like 2.2%, which is incredibly high. And quite a lot of it, as the numbers indicate, is due to basically importing existing innovation from abroad. Okay? The main sources of innovation that we find are the United States, the UK, and a couple of Scandinavian countries which are not reported here. Okay? These are the overall results. This is a table with the results for all countries. If you are interested, we can talk about this later. Now, in the following period, 1972-2011, we actually observe that there is a dramatic slowdown in both the recorded annual TFP growth and also in the indigenous innovation across countries. And this is true across countries. Now, if we plot, in fact, the indigenous the average annual indigenous innovation rates for the period 1950-72 on the horizontal, and on the vertical the counterparts for the period 72-2011, we will find out that in fact there is a dramatic shift downwards in indigenous innovation. And this is, in fact, much more pronounced for the US and the UK than for any other country. You see that the proportional effect is much greater for the US and the UK. Now, nevertheless, the US and the UK are among the leaders in terms of indigenous innovation, but clearly they are now, in this later period, in the company of Canada, Finland, and Sweden.
Raicho, we have to
Yes.
stop now.
Okay. So we also have a couple of other results which allow us, let me just show this one graph in which we plot the indigenous innovation shocks for the US. Okay, so what we see here is that there is a gradual decline in the magnitude and variance in the indigenous innovation shocks in the 1950s and in the 1960s, and then there is a partial recovery after the early 1980s, associated with much smaller variability in the TFP shocks. And then finally, what we do is we compare those series to what is, the US indigenous innovation shocks to what's happening in other countries. This is the final graph that I'm going to show, is a comparison between the US numbers and the UK numbers. So what we find out here is that indeed indigenous innovation in the US was higher in the 1950s and 60s than in the UK. And then afterwards, the two series more or less shadow each other. Okay? And with this, I would like to finish and give a chance to our next speaker to discuss the relation between our measures of indigenous innovation and measures of economic culture. Okay, thank you.
It's always a challenge to be invited by Ned to appear in Casa Italiana with these very big issues. In the rest of my life, I tackle with much smaller questions, but this is the biggest of all here. And but to start with, economists have started to study the role of culture, so values and beliefs that are transmitted from one generation to another. And there's a literature. It used to be just sociologists, now it's economists also. And why not relate these values to innovations, as I'll do right now. So the question is this, whether differences in culture, values and attitudes transmitted from one generation to the next help explain differences in the rate of indigenous innovation as calculated by friend Raicho here across countries. Are some countries better endowed with a culture conducive to innovation? And which cultural attributes are we talking about? There are two papers that precede this study. One that Raicho and Ned did in 2006. There's one I did with Ned in 2009. And basically what we did there was to summarize the cultural variables taken from surveys, value surveys, using the method of principal components, and then using linear regressions to find the relationship between different labor market outcomes and these principal components. But this time around, I was going to do something different. So, yes, in May, when we had the meeting, I remember Richard Nelson said, do case studies. That was one point. Don't believe endogenous growth. That was another one. He actually also said, don't use TFP growth, which we persist in doing. And read Schumpeter. That was the, I did read Schumpeter again. And I did do case studies of innovators in my home country who have become sort of internationally successful. And thankfully, my country has only 300,000 inhabitants. So talking to 4 people there is equivalent to talking to 4,000 people in the US and 12,000 in India. But we talked to more than 4, but there was like, when you talk to one and then to another, you get sort of the same kind of feeling that they're saying the same thing. So we're trying to figure out, instead of just reading Ned's book, what are the values that are important when you talk to these people? I mean, talk to the real innovators and see what they say. So there's a computer software company, CCP, that produced a computer game where people can play simultaneously the same game even though they're located in different countries. There's this company, Calidris, that what it did is actually an interesting story that there was a guy who failed calculus in his first year university course, and as a result had to study computer codes and writing software. And he came up with this code to predict which passenger would show up for a flight and who would not show up. And this is now used by airlines all over the place. So this is another innovator, I guess a Hayekian innovator. And then there's another computer game company. And then there's the one that produces prosthetic limbs that employs 2,200 people. So we got to talk to all these people. And here's one thing they say, that trust matters. Trust when you deal with creditors, your employees, customers. And in small countries, you take trust as given. In a big country, you have to earn it. These people, they value uncertainty. So that what they all have in common is an ability to thrive in an environment of uncertainty, that like Knightian uncertainty, where you don't know whether you'll be paid at the end of the month or not. So these are not people that are prone to anxiety. They thrive on challenges and making moves and being independent and
it's in my book.
And being independent, being your own boss, having freedom, creating something. Yes, power distance is important, that people who work with you are willing to challenge you. Instead of obeying, they challenge you so that people are critical of each other. That was one thing. And starting being international, not confined to one country. So Nokia in Finland had to start out looking outward. And so the themes here is they like the rewarding nature of work. Trust is important. Interest in working in a creative industry. Desire for independence. Ability to thrive in an environment characterized by uncertainty. Obedience not desirable. Obedience per se, you want people to think independently. And then money enters, but not as the prime factor. It's more the joy of succeeding. And so to test whether these values, if there's any relationship between Raicho's TFP calculations and these values, they use two data sets. One is a data set of 20 OECD countries. The other is a data set with European regions, so quite small regions in Europe. And so if we start with the countries, so we take Raicho's calculation of indigenous and imported innovation, and then take measures of values from the European Value Study and the World Value Survey. And then also take account of institutions, because countries may be stuck with bad institutions, so they may not have the best institutions given their set of values due to the problem of collective action and so forth. So they take two institutional variables. One is a measure of economic freedom, and then a sub-index of freedom from corruption to see if that works. We, of course, explored all sorts of institutional variables, but these are the ones that are included here. And here's the countries. And then the method used was a method which economists haven't used so far, as far as I know, a method which was proposed by Harold Hotelling in 1934. And the idea is this, that you have two sets of variables, call them x and y, and you can measure the x1, the x2, down to xn, but they're all a component of some latent variable x star. And then there's another set of variables from y1 to yn, and they are all common components of a latent variable y star. So you can think of a country's culture or values as being the axis. So the x1, x2, x3, etc. are different responses to values questions. And then the outcomes are the Y's, so that could be the TFP growth. In Ned's work, job satisfaction, which is related to TFP growth, or labor market outcomes. So what this method does is that it assigns weights to the x1, x2 down to xn, and the y1, y2 down to the yn, to construct the latent variables x star and y star so as to maximize the correlation between the two. So I sort of like this idea because we just give the computer software the data, and the software sort of produces these two variables that we don't observe, x star and y star. And then you can look at the results. You may like it or you don't like it, but if it makes sense, it sort of is supportive of what you are thinking. Yeah. And so here, the x star variables are the level of trust, to which extent people desire job security, to which extent people desire being able to take the initiative on the job, to be able to achieve on the job, and what they teach their children, whether it's to be obedient, independent, or imaginative. Oh, it's been 10 minutes. Right? You can't turn this off. I'll use up 1 minute turning this off.
Is that a time warning? It's very appropriate if it is a time warning.
Okay, so and competition is to what extent people like competition. And then there are two institutional variables, the heritage index of economic freedom and freedom from corruption. So you assign weights to all these factors to construct X star, and then Y star is the indigenous TFP growth, the imported TFP growth, and job satisfaction. This is based on Ned's book, that should be related. And then you get here, the first column is the weights used to construct the latent variable X star. The second column is the correlation between each variable and this latent variable X star. And so what you get is that economic freedom and freedom from corruption are very important, so big positives. Liking competition is a positive. Teaching children to be independent is positive. Teaching them to be obedient, which tends to be observed in Southern Europe, especially if you look at the regional data, it's the south of Europe, is a negative. Wanting to achieve on the job is positive. And then when you get a minus and a plus, you get into trouble. But the job initiative is usually because there's correlation across these variables. So the job initiative has a very high correlation with the X star, but a negative weight, and you have to think whether the negative weight is explained by job initiative being correlated with some of these other variables. But anyway, so the big picture is that there's some support here for these values that I was listing.
You didn't mention imagination, which theoretically has got to be very important.
Imagination is there with the plus. Teaching children to be imaginative, independent is a plus. Teaching them to be obedient is a minus. Liking competition is a big plus. Economic freedom is a big plus. And then you can see from these calculations of TFP growth, indigenous, imported, that also has pluses there. And the correlation between the two, we can call the X star dynamism, and the Y star is performance or growth, is 0.93. So there's some evidence that there's a link between the two. And if you plot the indigenous TFP growth here against the X star, which you can call dynamism, you get this clear positive relationship. So on the top there you have the US and some European countries like Sweden, Denmark, Finland are doing quite well, the Netherlands, Ireland. But at the bottom you have Greece and Japan. I didn't expect that, but Japan is down there. And Norway, which is not a surprise. And here you have X star against Y star. So there's again a positive relationship. And then we got an index which is taken from outside it's called Global Creativity Index. It's taken from outside this study just to check for robustness, and you get a positive relationship. And then you repeat this. I need to go on, right?
One more minute.
Yeah. For regions in Europe, so again, you have the values. And now for regions, you can actually look at outcomes like unemployment, participation, and average hours worked, which should be related to TFP growth. And you get that there's a minus that teaching children to be independent is good for unemployment. Teaching them to be imaginative and tolerant is good for unemployment, that is, reduces unemployment. Liking initiative on the job is good for unemployment. And here you'll rank the worst and the best European regions. So the highest social capital in Europe would be Copenhagen. And here is one in Sweden, Jutland in Denmark, and the southern part of Sweden. The worst are in Slovenia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and another one in Bulgaria. So what's interesting is that you can explain the divergence of labor market outcomes in Europe using
Microphone, please.
What?
Microphone.
Yeah,
To speak in the mic.
you can explain a lot of the divergence of labor market outcomes in Europe using these values variables. It's no surprise that northern Italy is different from southern Italy, but there's such a
If Saif is going to speak.
discrepancy. And here you see the X star against unemployment. There's a downward sloping relationship, X star against average hours, X star against Y star. And so what you get is a summary here is that you get that these values variables using this method of canonical correlations have some association with TFP growth and labor market outcomes. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
Good morning, everyone. Today what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit extra on conceptualizing what it is that we mean by indigenous innovation, and to try and draw parallels and differences between different scholars' ideas of indigenous innovation. So generally, when people think about innovation and entrepreneurship, the predominant model, at least in academic circles, is the idea of what is called the linear model of economic advance and scientific advance. And this is a pretty straightforward conception of how the world economy and science and technological advancement works. Basically, scientists come up with findings, applied scientists discuss how they can be applied, and then engineers make useful products out of them, and then entrepreneurs make money by selling them. In this sort of simplified conception, and I know this is a caricature, but I only have 15 minutes, so I have to caricature it. In this conception, it's a pretty straightforward idea, and this, to a very large extent, inspired, this is how Vannevar Bush thought of it. He was a very influential person in the history of science and economic policy in the US. And, this calls for a very simple recipe. If you'd like to have more economic growth, you'd need more technology. If you'd like more technology, you need more science. If you need more science, you need to have the government subsidize more and more scientific research. Pretty straightforward. This has the benefit of being very amenable to bureaucratic and statistical analysis, because you can easily make correlations between science spending and economic growth, because they're usually correlated, and you can always assume causality, more or less. This, to a very large extent, inspired how the National Science Foundation, the NIH, have been funded. This is also how the neoclassical growth model views economic growth, that capital accumulation is the short-run answer, but in the long run, the only sustainable way for long-run economic growth is through exogenous technological change, the idea that change just comes from the laboratory, not from the workings of the economy. And then this is also, to a very large extent, how Schumpeter, in his conception of entrepreneurship, thinks. In other words, there are the scientists and the lab people who come up with those innovations, and entrepreneurs then make money off of them. In other words, we could say this is a way of looking at the world whereby innovation is a laboratory-based activity, whereas entrepreneurship is a market-based activity, and the people who do the two of them are different people. And I'm caricaturing this view in order to better express our alternative view, which is A little bit different, I'll get to it in a second. But the problem with the linear model is that the evidence doesn't really sound very supportive. If you look at a lot of the most important innovations and products that have been invented, most importantly the steam engine, it did not come about because of scientific findings. We did not make the steam engine because first we figured out thermodynamics. The steam engine was invented, and then people were able to use it and study, and then the science of thermodynamics came about. Another reason, another problem with this evidence is that Britain witnessed the Industrial Revolution while basically having almost no government public funding of scientific research. France, on the other hand, had extensive government funding and elaborate academic titles and so on, but it didn't really lead to much economic innovation, at least not much compared to Britain. Also, if you look at the US became the richest economy in the world before it instituted its programs of heavy scientific funding. And then after it instituted those programs, after it increases scientific fundings, we did not witness an enormous increase or an exponential increase in economic growth as a result of this. So if you look at the US growth before the NIH and the NSF, you'll find that roughly they're the same. Whereas if the linear model were correct, then you would expect growth with the NIH and the NSF to be much higher than before. So this is the problem with the linear conception, and I think a lot of economists have a problem with it, and a lot of economists would see that it is different. For instance, Adam Smith, his conception is that innovation comes along fundamentally and primarily from the factories themselves that are making things. Workers on the job figure out newer, better, cheaper, more efficient ways of making things. Secondly, come the machine makers. The people who make machines are always finding ways of making them better. And thirdly, and only thirdly, and he ranks these in terms of importance, only thirdly are what he calls philosophers and men of speculation. They are essentially not as important as the first two in terms of actually real-world innovation. This is not... excuse me, could you please look into the PowerPoint slides? It's not moving. Plug in the laptop. I'm sorry for this. Yes. So another economist who passed away recently, unfortunately, Nathan Rosenberg, in his conception, he views innovation as being the product of problem solving. And he has a very nice definition of what an industrial society is, which is that an industrial society is a society with a heavy capacity for problem solving. Problem solving driven by inducement mechanisms, which are not financial, and this is a key point. There's always money to be made if you invent the new thing. So you can't really say that money is the thing that made those inventions happen. Usually what makes inventions happen are what he calls the inducement mechanisms. And some of these inducement mechanisms come from previous innovations. So for instance, we invent a faster engine. That means that the brakes that we have on the car now are not useful. So now we need to make new, more efficient brakes. Safety, accidents, labor strikes, all of those things are inducement mechanisms that drive people to innovate, and in a more realistic way than the linear model. Now, also, if we look at how engineers view innovation, and I studied mechanical engineering, and I've always been very interested in this topic. So if you read the history of how engineers have studied, say, in particular, those two very interesting cases I've come across of the jet engine and the retractable airplane landing gear, you see very extensive, detailed micro histories of how these innovations came about, and it completely flies in the face of the sort of exogenous model, because those were people who were, according to what Vicente mentions it is a process of unforesighted variation and selective retention. It's the engineers and, basically coming up with new ideas and new things, and there's no way to know whether this is going to work or not. So after you've tried it, it happens. If it works, you adopt it, and then you're faced with a new set of problems which you hadn't even foreseen before, and then you need to find new solutions for it. This is the way in which Vicente conceives it, and this is how he explains the retractable airplane landing gear. Before the process started, there was nobody who could have predicted that this was how the outcome is going to be. After years of problems and solutions, they came out with this. With Scranton's description of the jet engine innovation, he calls it cut and try engineering. And I think this is a very good way of putting it. You try and you see, and then if it works, it works. If not, it doesn't. Essentially, the way we conceive of indigenous innovation is a summation of all these previous economists that I've mentioned, Rosenberg's and scientists and so on, in that people carry out these problems, this evolutionary, complex, messy process that is unforesighted, under the guiding light of a price mechanism in a market where prices allow people to figure out what is necessary and what is not necessary, and what is profitable and what isn't. So if we look at, and in a sense, this reminds us of Hayek's conception of a market economy, but I think there are very important differences between Hayek's conception and Professor Phelps's conception of what it is to be an entrepreneur and an innovator. And so Hayek's conception is that entrepreneurship is more or less arbitrage. An entrepreneur is a person looking at all the different prices in a market and trying to see where there is an opportunity for arbitrage whereby you're able to increase your profitability. But in Professor Phelps's work, you see that an entrepreneur is not so much in the process of arbitrage as in the process of discovery. It is the entrepreneur himself who brings about the causal factors that shape the market, that shape the prices, that create the conditions of the market, rather than just being a passive recipient of those processes. For Hayek, prices communicate knowledge and market conditions to entrepreneurs, but in our conception, basically, you'd see that there are, to go back to Professor Zoega's work, there are deeper cultural and moral motivations that shape entrepreneurs' desires and motivations. It's not just about making money. There are cultural values that come into this, that make this possible. It isn't just, everybody wants to make money, but not everybody comes up with interesting innovations out of it. And, the key point here is that it is possible to have a very prosperous, highly productive, capitalist free market economy without it being necessarily innovative. And that difference between a prosperous capitalist economy and an innovative capitalist economy is exactly what we're concerned with. This isn't to say that we don't think that a capitalist economy is a good thing. Of course it is. It's a prerequisite. However, that doesn't go enough towards our conception of what it is to be a dynamic economy that offers its people mass flourishing, as the title of Professor Phelps's book suggests. And I think an excellent example to look at this is the example of Saudi Arabia. Now, people generally think Saudi Arabia is just rich because it has a lot of oil, which is not entirely true, because Saudi Arabia is actually very much a free market economy. Taxes are very low, free enterprise is very easy. People can start businesses and make a lot of money out of it. There are, of course, it's not a perfect free market, but it is to a very large extent much freer than in other places. And yet we see that it is not an innovative place. It's not a place where new innovations come along. On the other hand, perhaps the archetype of the indigenously innovative economy would be 18th and 19th century Britain. And this, I think, this contrast between modern-day Saudi Arabia versus 18th century Britain is exactly the telling difference between a free market economy in the Hayekian sense versus an indigenously innovative economy. And one final thing, if I'd had a few more minutes, I would have liked to dwell more on this, but basically, how do we conceive of this in a historical perspective? And essentially, we've done a lot of reading on historical terms of what economic innovation, where can it fit in. One interesting work I came across is the work of Sir John Glubb, the British scholar and military man. And his work is to a very large extent similar to Anthony Gibbon's work on the Roman Empire, as well as Ibn Khaldun's work on the rise and fall of nations from 1,000 years old. And it describes the stages of how a nation advances economically. What is interesting, initially there's the age of pioneers and the age of conquest in which people have this honor, this motivation to go around and expand the nation, set up their nation, expand its boundaries and so on. And he says, after that has settled down, after the dust has settled down on the setting up of the nation and the fighting and so on, then people enter the age of commerce, where they dedicate that buccaneering maverick spirit, if you want, not into war, but into capital accumulation, into innovation, and into economic productivity. And I think this might be the stage, if we want to look at it in a historical perspective, where indigenous innovation thrives the most. Moving on further, this affluence that is created by the age of commerce, generations, after a few generations, will itself lead to the high noon of civilization, and after that you get a massive increase in affluence. But then that affluence itself sets the seeds for its own demise by making people essentially become more and more lazy and less of that spirit. And the interesting thing that you find with John Glubb's work is the age that comes right before the age of decadence, he calls the age of the intellect. And this, to a very large extent, might be offensive to some of us since we're all academics. But he says, before the stage of decline is the stage when you have a lot of academics and a lot of universities and a lot of people who think that, all that you need in order to fix the problems of life are just to have people who have big brains to solve these problems. And this, to a very large extent, of course, will remind us of, the conception of scientific socialism, that you can just run society with the scientific idea. And it's remarkable the examples that he brings about from nations and places all over the world where this is the dominating, that this really was the thing that led to the demise. And then after that comes the age of decadence. So quite one last thing in a historical perspective, perhaps, the linear model and the idea that, we can just bring about economic growth and prosperity through more and more investment in simple science could be the harbinger of the age of the intellect, whereas when we look at an economy that is innovative, it is probably more into the age of commerce. And so, one idea perhaps out for discussion is that could it be that in the last 100 or 150 years, the West has moved from the age of commerce to the age of the intellect? This is a very big question, and I'm sure we'll have many different opinions on it, but I thought I would leave it out there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, now we're going to hear from Philippe Aghion, and he's on tape.
So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper by Raicho Bojilov, Edmund Phelps, and Gylfi Zoega on innovation and its transmission across countries. I would have loved to be at the conference with you today, but I had to teach at the Collège de France, and therefore I could not, there was no way I could be physically with you. But I wish you good luck. The program looks absolutely terrific, and I'm very sad I'm missing the conference. So let me turn into the discussion of the paper. It's a very interesting paper that looks at the decomposition of TFP growth into a domestic part, a domestic innovation-driven part, with transmissible innovation and non-transmissible innovation, and a spillover part from other countries' innovation. So, to do this decomposition, the paper looks at 21 OECD countries over the period 1950-2011, and the main findings are first that most of the transmitted innovation, that innovation that diffuses somewhere else, originates in the US and to a smaller extent in the UK and Scandinavian countries. And the second finding is that if you look at the period 1950-1972 compared with 1972-2011, you see a decline in TFP growth, and which is mainly due to the decline in catching up in the spillover-driven growth, more than in the indigenous growth, which is not confund indigenous and endogenous. I mean the domestic growth. So those findings are very interesting, and there is this table that ranks countries in terms of how much they generate their own innovation, which their own transmissible innovation, and to which extent they grow thanks to the innovation, the transmissible innovation from other countries, and the table is remarkably in coherence with in line with what you would guess in terms of who are the leaders and who are not the leaders when it comes to innovation and to generating innovation that diffuses somewhere else. So here are my main points about the paper. First point is that I would like to very much look at how your distinction between transmissible, non-transmissible innovation fits into the decomposition into frontier, non-frontier innovation. Various works that, Ned has done in the past, or that I've done with various co-authors. We had the distinction between catching up, frontier innovation and non-frontier, and frontier growth and non-frontier growth. And so it would be very interesting to see, how you map frontier versus non-frontier TFP growth with frontier versus non-frontier innovation. With the appropriate metrics for the latter. So that's the first comment that I have. The second comment is that why don't you also explore patent citations to distinguish between, transmissible and less transmissible innovation, or to distinguish between indigenous and spillover-driven innovation. And we can use, the fact that, you are more or less cited by other countries, or you are more important innovation that's more or less cited. And we have more measures of frontieress of innovation using citations. And it would be very interesting to see whether using an approach based very much on patent and patent citation, you reproduce the same kind of ranking as the one that you get just using TFP growth data. That I think would be very interesting. Of course, it may probably another paper, but that's an obvious question that one may want to ask. Another measure is also firm creation, new firm creation. What do we know about innovation done by new firms versus innovation done by existing firms? And is there a mapping between that and your different kinds of innovation? And also, when you have patent data, you can look at where the patentors, the inventors come from, which country they come from. Do they come from countries that are leaders or countries that are not leaders? And how is that, that's a way also to look at spillovers, you see, from countries. The spillover may act through the researchers that, participate in innovation. You could have an innovation patented in the US, but the nationality of some of the patenters may be from other countries, or the other way around. For example, China, it's very important to look at the identity of researchers, to look at the spillovers. China, for example, had, many innovations have co-authors that have gone to the US, and similarly, and so it would be very interesting to know that, you see, to have a better idea of spillovers. Another issue is the measuring TFP growth correctly. I'm doing some work currently with Pete Clino from Stanford, where we look at the link between measured TFP growth and innovation patenting. And the view is that TFP growth may not always reflect the appropriate amount of innovation, partly because of creative destruction, partly because new firms are counted as if they were doing the same kind of things as the old firms, and statistical offices don't properly take into account the fact that new firms may be better or different from old firms that they replace. And that's a source certainly of mismeasurement. And so maybe part of the slowdown that you have in the paper has to do with this mismeasurement, and that's something that you may want to analyze. And that links to the previous comment with to the effect that you should use patenting and patent citation as an alternative measure of innovation. Another comment I have is to talk about try to explain why do you have delays in the transmission of technological shocks across countries. I have colleagues from the Bank of France that argues that Japan, for example, and European countries, of course, adopted the electricity wave with delay, and the question is, why did they adopt them with delay? And one reason may be education, higher education, structural reforms, and that more flexible markets. Countries that have a better R&D base and more flexible markets, more easy entry, may adopt earlier. And so it would be very interesting to understand the source of delay in the transmission, or the extent to which countries can get transmissible innovation from countries that initiate those transmissible innovation. Of course, there is a related question: is what makes countries leaders? What makes the US the US? There have been work, by Acemoglu and Verdier trying to compare US versus Scandinavia, trying to say, well, US chose a social regime that made it more prone to be leader versus Scandinavia that was more follower. I don't know about that. And but it will be very interesting to try and understand what are the characteristics of countries that are more like leaders and some countries that are less leaders, to try to explain a bit the ranking in your table. I think that's a very interesting way to pursue. And finally, the tables I found, as I said at the beginning, extremely compelling and very much, giving you what you would expect, except for one country, which is Israel, where I was hoping that you would have more, indigenous innovation. It's true they have a lot that they get through imitating, but they have now a very kind of ecosystem of innovation which is very developed with a lot of incubators, with a whole ecosystem for generating innovation. And I was surprised that there was not more going on in Israel also. And also I was surprised why you get a measured TFP growth, which is so much less than the actual TFP growth. The predicted TFP growth that you have in Israel with the various components, when you add them up, is much, much less of the actual TFP growth. I was just wondering why you were getting this finding. But otherwise, I find it's a very exciting line of research. We really want to know why some countries lead and why some countries are followers. We want to understand, what makes you become a leader, and of course, there is a lot, that will be done, I'm sure, on the, following the path that you open with this research. I apologize because I had to do it in 2 bits, but I repeated in the beginning of my second part what I said at the end of the first, to make sure that you would not miss any part of my message. And anyway, once again, very stimulating line of research, and I'm sure it will be followed by much more after, on your path. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Okay, so I've done it, but again, it was interrupted in the middle. But this time, I repeated what I had done. So Anna, whenever you want, we can send.
Well, thank you, Ned, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my second time at this conference. I went through all the materials, and I've read the book, been listening to the type of work coming out of here, and I find it rather difficult. And it reminds me, an old philosophy professor always told me, well, when you find it difficult, and the person, he called it his no-dope principle, and he said the person who wrote it is no dope, read it again until you understand it. I'm starting to slowly understand what's behind this. So the recap, the papers I saw today is on the transmission of innovation, on values in innovation, and on values in the labor market. There was also something on scientific advancement, but I hadn't seen that. The idea here is to generate a measure of pushing out of the frontier, the indigenous innovation, then find things that correlate with that pushing out values, or find social capital values that correlate with labor market outcomes, to try to understand are there values that are the driving force of these processes of innovation and satisfaction in life that generate the good life. So in the values and labor market outcome, we looked at unemployment, male labor force participation, and average hours on kind of the Y variables, and then social capital, a whole slew of them, but 12 different variables. What's interesting, of course, is that the hard work shows up with a negative. So when you teach your children to enjoy hard work, it's probably not good. So they should play, and I've done that with my children, and now they're working hard, but they enjoy the early part. And the tolerance is important. With this work, you can then look across regions, and this is actually quite interesting. You can see in regions how these values correlate with outcomes at the regional level, and I think that's a good source of variation to understand. With the innovation, I had some questions about this, but in the way the results were all made sense, and indeed there was a very strong correlation, possibly by construction, between the indigenous innovation and these values. So I think the more interesting part for me to think about is the decomposition of this productivity into the adoption and the indigenous, the part that pushes out the frontier. One thing I worry about in this data is using the Penn World tables. Now, there's been some discussion just last Friday in the blogosphere about what are we measuring with TFP. So if you're using Penn World tables version 8, to look ahead, this is the OECD's MFP data, and I've put together productivity data sets myself. I know it's really hard to measure this stuff, and who knows what the time series do. This was the OECD one, and this is the Penn World tables. It turns out they forgot to add hours worked, so I hope you're not using version 8 in the work. So in any case, we find, and this makes sense, though, for everything else we've seen, is that in the early years, up until 1972, it seems that the shocks of indigenous innovation were higher on average, and there was more variation. There just seemed to be more experimentation going on, and that seems to have slowed down. And so there's other corroborative evidence for that. I have some questions that I'll discuss with the authors later about what I find here. One thing I worry about is business cycles. We know that business cycles show up in measured TFP through some kind of cyclical values of TFP. And we know business cycles are correlated across countries, and there's transmissions, for example, from the US to Europe in business cycles. And I worry about how much of that were labor-linked transmission versus other things. But mostly I worry about the scaling. Let's say all countries had exactly the same values towards innovation. How often does a new idea then strike? What's the hazard that a group of innovative, experimenting people will get the shock? And clearly, large countries are going to have more of them than small countries. And so I worry about how to scale what you would expect if everything were the same. But mostly, this work has made me think a lot about the cross-country differences, not just in indigenous innovation, but also in adopting new stuff. I've been linking uses of ICT at the firm-level data for about 15 different European countries. And when you control for everything, what is remarkable is that some countries use a lot of it and get the new stuff very quickly after it comes out, and other countries just lag behind. And it doesn't correlate with the prices of this technology. It doesn't correlate with complementary inputs. So there's something that's preventing areas not just from doing new stuff, but even adopting the stuff that's 2-3 years old and using it in your own processes. I've seen, and the OECD has a lot of work on this too, that the regulatory environment often holds back firms from adopting. And when they adopt, they still have to experiment with the new technology. They're not often sure what works. And we find out that regulation harms that. And so what then sits in my mind is, can these values, what's the mechanism through which we see the values correlate with the indigenous innovation? Is that through policy? Is it that people in a certain society set up a regulatory and business and organizational framework, labor markets, product markets, the way they do the schooling, et cetera, the way they set up businesses, the way they set up the banking system, that then determines what type of innovation we get? So is that the causal mechanism? And then I kind of worry about the simultaneity with the values. On the World Values Survey website, they themselves say that there's a process as countries innovate and become richer. They move towards values that are self-realization and rationality versus being security organized. And if that endogeneity is there, then how do I think about this process? Is it that if we just let these countries grow and innovate, they would get the values that enjoy that? Another question is, well, if it really is values that's exogenous and prior, if people don't want to innovate and they get a society that's not innovative, who are we as economists to say they're not maximizing utility?
It's job satisfaction.
Well, so there's job satisfaction. So, and I don't think that statement's true. I think it's more a fact, and this is what's been really puzzling me in the last decade about policies that I see happening, discussions I have in Europe about structural reforms. Kind of all economists agree we need to move on with this, yet there's a lot of societal pushback in not wanting this. And my question is it that people do not understand how better economic policy will actually enhance their life, even given their values that might be traditional and that might like security? And then it's a question of we need to get the message out. We need someone who's really glib, who's really, can talk and tell people the way it is. And, it really is the values, stupid. That's Stephanopoulos who got the issue out. So we need people to sell the idea to the population that we need to move ahead on this. Thanks.
Well, perhaps we envisioned a few minutes of Q&A, but I've been a dreadful moderator, and we've fallen way behind. I think maybe we do have, maybe we can have one or two questions Yes, sir.
So I've encountered rather widely this slowdown in innovation since the 70s. And Richard Florida refers to low-hanging fruit no longer being available. But if I look at my automobile between 1955 and 1975, and then 1985 and today, or teaching with a Kodak parasol slide projector from 1955 until 2000, and now I get my PowerPoint images off my cell phone to the projector. What are the examples of this slowdown in innovation?
Well, I'll tackle that question very, very succinctly. Charlie, are you fixing your hair or you want to help me?
No, I thought you were collecting questions.
Oh, okay, that's a great idea. Maud, would you pass the mic to Charlie Calameras?
First, congratulations on a great session. This was really a wonderful beginning to the conference. The thing that to me didn't ring so obviously true was the Japanese story. So of course Japan invented the word kaizen, which is about as close to Ned's book as any concept I can think, continuous innovation. If you visit a Japanese factory, especially an electronics factory or an automobile factory, you see how much the ethos there is of continuous innovation by employees, suggestions, all of that sort of thing. So I wonder, my bottom line is I wonder whether there isn't a sector-specific or leadership within industry-specific factor here. So I wonder, if the next step isn't to look at not just a national level, but also, how can you make sense out of the story that Sony, Toyota, and NEC are happening in this backward country? I can't.
Any other questions? Might be Luigi Bonatti.
Yes. My question relates to the slowing down of total factor productivity in between the 2 decades from the 50s to the 70s with respect to the following decades. So I'm wondering whether structural change played a role in the sense that, at least for many countries in the 50s and in the 60s, many European countries, still the transition from agriculture to manufacturing to industry was important, while then in the following period what was going on in most countries was the deindustrialization process. So how do you take into account of this factor?
Process?
Deindustrialization.
De-uni what process?
I'm saying the deindustrialization process.
Deindustrialization
process.
Deindustrialization.
Deindustrialization.
Process. Sorry for that. I'm referring.
It was all those computers and all those innovations that got rid of those other industries.
Yes, that's true. I'm referring in a way to the so-called Baumol's disease, if it played a role in...
what was Baumol's disease again? I've forgotten.
The fact that shifting from manufacturing to services, there is also less role for technological progress, so that this can slow down the rate of...
Okay, thank you very much. These are all very difficult questions. With regard to the first question, I'll just take a minute to try to answer. With regard to the first question, of course, there are lots of indexes of innovation, but I don't think I've ever seen an index of innovation that's gone up, that started speeding up in the 70s and reached a higher rate in all later decades. Almost all the indexes are down. What is true, I think, is there's been an explosion of patents So if your index is the number of new patents granted, then you might think that we're just awash with new innovations, but a lot of those patents don't lead to new products. They don't. The company gets the patent, but nothing happens. China is creating an enormous number of patents, but very little genuine innovation. So, Charlie, your question was about Japan, whether we shouldn't be getting down to particular industries. Yeah, I mean, it's always been felt that some industries naturally lead more to innovation than others. So if you're in Switzerland with all those drug companies, you're set for a high rate of innovation. And if you're not in Switzerland or Germany or the US, then you're going to have a harder time. But Germany, which was such a great pioneer in innovation in the 19th century, is one of the lowest in innovation now. It's a trading nation. It's not an innovation nation. And Switzerland, my Swiss friends convinced me they were very innovative, but now Raicho's results show that Switzerland is very weak in innovation. So, and Luigi, I don't know what to say. Yeah, the structure of the economy is always evolving, and now we have a much more of a service economy in some countries. But look, where do we have a big service economies? Isn't it the U.S. and the U.K.? And those are the countries where innovation held up. If I had just one point to make about all this discussion this morning, it's that I think we all have a tendency to think big about innovation, and I think we should think small. We should think about the nurse who, after 10 years of experience in the operating room, sees a much better way to organize the operating room. That's an innovation that really counts, that will increase incomes, productivity of hospitals, and theoretically at least will show up in the GDP. And nobody's talking about all the zillions of people who every day go to work thinking about, isn't there a better way to do this damn thing that I'm doing? And this is not discussed. And the spirit of the nation, the values are so important for determining that. Well, thank you very much.